Okay, Maggie is an assistant digital projects and preservation archivist for the Washington State Archives, and she's going to explain to us today how to preserve oversized items. A lot of us end up with things like this that have been passed down in the family, and they don't just neatly fit in things that we might have. And yet we know it's not a good idea to fold it or roll it up. So she's going to explain to us what we should be doing. Thank you very much, Maggie.
You're welcome. Thank you everyone for having me here. Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you guys today about this. So I'm going to be going over some preservation problems that are inherent to oversized records. I'm also going to talk about the best ways to store them to sort of mitigate some of those issues, and some basic preservation and mild conservation methods you can use to take care of your records if they are, if there is any problems or if they're experiencing any sort of degradation. Let's see, I'm going to demonstrate some storage methods that are good for them in your home, and then I'll answer some questions at the end if you have them. So I think maybe the best way to do that would be to put your questions in the chat box, and then we can kind of look through them at the end, and I'll answer them as we go. All right, so I'm going to try and share my screen here so you can see my presentation. All right. Okay, so what is an oversized record? I think it's anything that is larger than 8.5 by 14, because then once it's that size, it will no longer easily fit into a standard size box. Oversized records could be posters, they can be maps, they can be architectural drawings or blueprints, panoramas, certificates, artwork, register books, or large volumes or scrapbooks are all considered oversized materials. So some of the problems that are inherent to oversized materials include acidic paper. Since the early 19th century, most papers were made with a wood pulp slurry, which contained the lignin that binds the fibers together. Wood pulp papers replaced cotton rag in the 19th century. The lignin oxidizes as the paper is exposed to light, and that can make the paper look yellow. It can also cause the paper to become fragile or brittle. Newspapers in particular are notorious for this. Handmade papers were usually okay, and you can differentiate wood-based papers versus fabric-based papers by their watermarks and lines. Items backed with linen or muslin. Sometimes the material is impregnated with a starch that can make it look, that can give it a hard surface. And in this case, moisture can dissolve and the starch can cause ripplings. You'll see that on the image on the right-hand side where this was a map that was placed on top of a muslin background, and over time that's caused some problems for the map on top of it. The varnish and shellacking over maps. Sometimes maps were varnished as a protective treatment, which was also done, this was also done to globes as well. But the varnish yellows as it ages due to oxidation, and the more exposure to light it has, the darker it gets. The varnish can cause cracking and will usually need conservation. So the less light it's exposed to, the better. All right. So other problems, transparent papers. So these can be tracing papers, vellum papers, or a vegetable parchment. These have a variety of issues depending on the methods that were used to make it, and they tend to be pretty brittle and fragile and deteriorate quickly over time. And oftentimes they have a plastic coating. Plastic coating, also known as PVC material, which is polyvinyl chloride. It has a chlorine gas it releases a chlorine gas as it ages, and this can cause the plastic to break down. And sometimes it becomes sort of gooey and brittle. Animal skin. So animal skin is often called parchment or vellum. Parchment was usually made from calf or goat or sheep, and vellum was usually only made from the calf skin. It is not used much currently, but it was popular for many years for older documents and diplomas. Animal skins struggle with humidity, and water usually causes lots of problems that can't be easily treated. So you would, if you do suspect that you have an animal skin document, you would want to consult with a conservator about how to properly preserve it. Contemporary parchment is made from a cellulose fiber like trees or cotton or flax. So ink. Inks tend to fade due to light, heat, or moisture. If you're lucky enough to have a map that existed prior to the 1800s, they were primarily used oil-based, and they're relatively stable. Maps that are older than that, or if they're after the 1800s, they use oil-based ink, sorry, and they're relatively stable. Maps that are older than that can have manuscript ink, which can include iron gall ink, which is highly acidic. High humidity will deteriorate iron gall inks over time, and the iron gall, because it is so high in acid, will eat through paper, which is what you're seeing there on the left. This would require preservation or conservation work to fix. And if you have something that's this old, we would highly recommend creating a digital surrogate as soon as possible to capture what you have on the record before the ink really does damage. Another thing that we often come across with oversized items are poor repairs. So that would include people putting things like tapes or glues on the record. Glues have a tendency to sink through the pages, and that can accelerate acid degradation. It also stains the paper, and it doesn't always last. So sometimes people will put tape on there that's not a preservation tape or an archival tape. It'll dry up over time, and it will start to fall off, and so you'll end up with a stained document that is no longer being held together, so it will need conservation. And folding, I think this is probably the most common. Lots of things are folded. Mechanical folding, it weakens the paper, and it has a tendency to break and cause rips over time along the folds. So folding maps and things, once you realize that it's good to keep it unfolded, you'll want to make sure you have a place to put it, once you've done that. So we suggest avoiding, opening and closing it often, because doing that will make the problem worse. If you're not ready to store it in a location where it can be flat, just keep it folded and try not to open it too much. All right, so I'm going to talk about some poor storage. These are things that we see often. Rolled and vertical records. When you roll something, obviously it's going to need to be unrolled over time, and that can also, I'm going to talk a little bit how to unroll things, but storing them vertically places pressure on the edges of the item. So if you'll see on the left-hand side, these records have been stored vertically and rolled for many years, and they've started to rip along the edges, and they're sort of getting smashed, and they'll eventually start to disintegrate and fall apart. We also see hanging files. So if you hang something that sort of just puts stress on specific points and doesn't provide much support, so we don't usually recommend hanging. Overcrowding can warp the document from the weight. As you'll see on the right-hand side here, we have a group of, a set of maps that's overcrowded. There's like smaller size maps underneath and larger size maps on top, and you'll see that it's sort of distorted the maps on top, and it's causing some problems. So overcrowding is an issue. You want to make sure that you don't put too many documents together in a single location. Cutting and sectioning. So oftentimes, this is pretty common when, especially for use in scrapbooks and things. Cutting an oversized item for storage, they would often, it allows you to mount them together. And sometimes what they would do is they would cut the image and then they would put like a single piece of cloth between the gaps so that the sections could be folded easily into a scrapbook. Obviously, this isn't great. This is the example that I have here on the right was from one of our collection. What we ended up doing here was removing the object, the image from the scrapbook page, and then of course making a notation of what was there originally and having a digital surrogate. But then we stored that that oversized photograph flat in a large box so that it no longer needs to be folded. Lamination, so sometimes you'll see oversized records that have been laminated. The problem with lamination is that it is made of a plastic material that can shrink over time and that will warp your document underneath. And the folding that you'll see here also damages the paper. Same as newspapers, they're only meant to be folded once and should not be folded a second time. Like I said, that the opening and the closing of folded items can cause tearing. And they will easily break. So, so don't unfold anything until you know you have a place to store it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some good storage environments for oversized records. Firstly, minimizing exposure to light. Light accelerates deterioration and leads to brittle fibers that can cause papers to bleach, yellow, or darken. It also causes dyes to fade or change color, altering the legibility of the record. Any exposure to light, even for a brief time, is damaging because light damage is cumulative and it is irreversible. So it's not something that can be fixed by a conservator or an archivist. Using boxes or enclosures that prevent light from, prevent the document from being exposed to light is the best option. The next is a stable temperature. So you'll want to keep your records in a place that has a temperature no higher than 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So somewhere between 55 and 70 is good. And a stable relative humidity between 30 and 50%. A lower relative humidity is, of course, best. Because deterioration progresses at a slower rate at a colder temperature. Items expanding and contracting from dramatic temperatures pose a high risk. So, so don't keep your records in an attic or a basement or anywhere where there's going to be lots of temperature fluctuations. Anywhere where you store your records, make sure that they are clean and dust-free. Pollutants can cause harmful chemical reactions that lead to the formation of acids in materials. And this is a serious problem for paper and leather in particular. Paper will become discolored and brittle, and leather becomes weak and powdery if it's exposed to these particulates. Soot can abrade and disfigure materials as well. So make sure, again, store them in a clean place away from chemicals. Definitely not in a garage where cars are kept. And store away from food, water, or damp. Records that are close to garbage cans or water, or sometimes we'll see that records will be stored under leaky pipes, or of course in a basement where it's oftentimes damp. And these environments just attract pests who like to eat paper. So one of the best places to keep your records is actually in is in a closet in the middle of your house. Let's see here. The closets in the center of your house are usually stay at an even temperature, and they're not usually exposed to light. So other good options are map cases. Map cases are made of chemically stable materials. They have solvent-free powder coatings or anodized aluminum. If you have a wood map case, you can line it with a polyester film or a 4-ply rag board, and that'll help to seal the wood with a polyurethane coating. So the examples we have here, the picture on the left is actually from our collection. That's how we store maps. And then the picture on the right is actually from my house, or my last house. And I used to keep my map collection in this map case in my living room. And so it doubled as a coffee table and a great place to store my maps and art prints. So protective enclosures, these include boxes or folders. Enclosures are great, and they can protect your records from light. They can protect them from temperature and humidity fluctuations, leaks, and any sort of drinks getting knocked over while you're working on them. Boxes, objects larger than 15 by 9 inches should be stored flat. Boxes can be made up to 30 by 40 inches. And I know that there are some companies that, they can make custom boxes for you, but it does get pricey as you go up. So you'll want to make sure that it's something that, is really worth the cost. Boxes should be buffered and lignin-free with lids. But I'm going to explain buffered and unbuffered. I'm going to talk about unbuffered and buffered a little bit more. So I'm going to explain them to you now. The difference between buffered and unbuffered is their pH level. Buffered papers or enclosures have a pH that is slightly above neutral, which is at 7 pH, making it more alkaline. Unbuffered papers and boxes are neutral. And there is a lot of information about these online. So if there's any confusion about it, you can either email me or you can, check the internet. And there's some good resources out there about that. Folders are the least expensive storage enclosure. They're good for acidic items. They should be acid and lignin free and buffered for most paper artifacts. Blueprints are the exception, and they're the only ones that really should be stored in an unbuffered folder. Because blueprints are meant to be slightly acidic, and you don't want the folders to neutralize the materials or the inks on the blueprints. Folders should be somewhat larger than the sheet size. So you'll see on the example on the right here, you'll want to have some nice spacing around the object that's in the folder, so you don't have the situation where the object is poking out, because that can cause deterioration along the edges of your object. If you need to interleave multiple items in a folder, we recommend using an acid-free tissue or paper interleaved between each item. So that just prevents acid migration from one record to the other. So especially if you have something like a newspaper article or a clipping in the same folder as a poster or other document, the acid in the newspaper tends to travel. So interleaving those tissue papers between them will prevent that. And so just as a reminder, I put here that buffered is good for newspapers, acidic paper, black and white photos and negatives, and anything made of cotton or linen. Unbuffered is preferred for blueprints, color photos and negatives, leather or silk, or anything that is animal derived. Also, if you need to store things in a folder, do not overcrowd. So you'll want to keep it to less than 12 items per folder, depending on their size. So polyester film encapsulation. This is a good option if the items in your collection are fragile or frequently handled. The electrostatic charge can hold the paper fragments in alignment as well. This is not suitable for acidic objects, as the encapsulation can actually trap the acid. It's also not good for powdery media such as charcoal, soft pencil, or any sort of flaking paint. The static from the poly can dislodge the media, so try to avoid, you'll want to avoid that. You can back acidic materials with a buffered paper if you do need to put them in a mylar. Encapsulation will not slow the progress of acid deterioration. In order to do that, you will need to add buffered paper around the object. So as I said before, the buffered paper has a slightly higher pH that is above neutral, and that helps neutralize acidic objects such as newspaper, which can deteriorate really pretty quickly. But we don't recommend using it, or to be careful with using it, buffered papers on materials that are meant to have a more acidic composition, such as animal-derived objects or color photographs, because neutralizing these things could actually cause damage. Okay, so here's an example of encapsulation. Encapsulation is not lamination. Lamination is a process by which it's an actual sticky material that is adhering to the object itself. Encapsulation just creates a pocket. Polyester, which includes mylar or Melanix, polypropylene, polyethylene, are all generally acceptable plastics that must be free of external plasticizers, surface coatings, or UV inhibitors. And you can make an encapsulator yourself. So as you'll see here, you'll want to select and cut 2 sheets of polyester film that are at least 1.5 inches larger than the object to be encapsulated, and using a weight to hold it down in the center, and apply some double-sided tape along the 3 edges of the polyester film, and leave the backing on the tape until you're ready to encapsulate. We recommend using a 3M number 415 double-sided polyester transparent tape coated with an acrylic adhesive. At this point, you'll place the paper object within the tape boundaries and make sure that the object does not touch the tape. And then you'll lay the second piece of film over the object and align with all edges, and place the weight within the center to keep everything from slipping. And then you'll lift one end of the polyester film to remove the tape backing from the double-sided tape, and then lay the poly back over the tape. So you'll create a little sealed pocket. And then you can use a cotton to gently press, like a cotton cloth to gently press in the direction the film is closing. And when we did this presentation here at the archives, we actually gave this as a handout, but you can see the link below. The NPS.gov is the National Park Service. They actually have a lot of good resources on how to do preservation. So you'll find that this illustration there. Just a little bit of terminology, since I'm throwing out a lot of words here before we move on. Archival means there is no standard or legal definition for the word archival. Manufacturers often use this word to in their advertising, regardless of the quantity or the quality of their products. So just to keep an eye out for, if it does say that it's archival, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is. The more important words you'll want to look for are things like acid-free. Acid-free means that the enclosure has a neutral pH at the time of manufacture, but it can become more acidic over time. Lignin-free is another word to look for when you're researching boxes or folders. Lignin, as I said before, is an acid found in the wood pulp slurry used to create paper. And over time, it does break down and can cause paper to turn yellow and become brittle. And just to review again, buffered is made with an alkaline reserve or calcium carbonate that neutralizes acid and minimizes the chance of acid migration in your records. So it's good when used with plant-based materials, not animal-derived record. Unbuffered is non-alkaline, and like I said, it's best used with protein-based materials. Something you'll also want to keep an eye out for is whether or not it has passed your enclosure or your folder has passed the PAT test. And PAT, let me see if I can remember here, stands for, where did it go? Hold on, I lost my notes here, just a minute. Oh, the photographic activity test, pardon me. So it means that it's gone through, they have actually tested this and it's evaluated, and it has, it evaluates possible chemical interactions between enclosures and photographs after a long-term storage. So this is one of the most important things to look for, is whether or not your enclosures have passed the PAT test. Okay, another good way to store your records is by rolling. I know this seems counter to what I said earlier, but there are proper ways to roll your records. And this is good for items that are too large to store in boxes or cabinets. Generally, the tube that you use to roll your record into should be lignin-free. That's at least 4 inches in diameter. So the diameter of your roll does help to prevent damage. So the larger the roll, the better. The tube should extend beyond the sheets by at least 2 inches at each end. Non-archival tubes can be covered with a barrier sheet of like polyester film that's wrapped around the tube to secure. That's placed on the inside, and then secured with a double-sided tape underneath the poly. Let's see. So if you're not able to use a tube, you can also roll the object on its own using archival paper. So you can cover the front side of your document with archival paper and roll the front side towards the tube, and then wrap it in archival quality paper or polyester film to protect against abrasion or dust or pollutants. If you do it this way, you'll want to secure it with an undyed fabric or tape, an archival tape, and store horizontally. Obviously, we prefer that you don't use rubber bands, because rubber bands tend to harden and become brittle over time, and they can also stain your records as well. And they sometimes also become sticky, so then you'll have an issue where rubber bands are sticking to your object. So use an undyed fabric to tie up your rolled item. And you can also use polyester, so use a 4 to 5 mil polyester film and place the object inside. So I'm looking at my notes here. Yeah, so you can use a polyester film to roll with your object to prevent any sort of acid migration. Unfortunately, I didn't put a photograph here of the process we use, but basically it's, you have your object, and then you'll have an archival paper underneath, and then you'll put maybe a polyester on top. So you're creating sort of a sandwich, and then you're doing a roll. So proper handling of oversized records, you'll grab on the diagonal, and or you can also, so grabbing on the diagonal if it's a looser item, you can also use a flat support underneath to move it safely, another option is to have 2 people work together, as you'll see here. So some minor preservation and conservation work you can do on your records firstly involves removing grommets and staples. Grommets and staples can abrade surfaces and leave rust. As we know, metal tends to corrode as it's exposed to oxygen or sulfur. Metal produces an oxide or salt, which results in an orange sort of coloration. So remove grommets and staples or any sort of metal, anything that's keeping the records together with metal as soon as possible. Document cleaning pads and cloth bags filled with eraser crumbs. Residue from the crumbs can become trapped in the paper fibers and be abrasive, so be careful when using those. But these can be used to clean mold off of documents. Sponge erasers are vulcanized rubber. These are a good choice for cleaning torn. When cleaning torn areas, you just want to move in the direction of the tear and try to avoid purchasing sort of chemical sponges. Just sponge erasers are the best. You can also use a vacuum with a HEPA filter, as long as you put a nylon stocking over the hose to protect the document. This is a good way to clean from dust or any inactive mold that might be on your record. Mending is something that is best left to a conservator, but the best things to use are water moistenable gummed linen tapes or a wheat starch paste with Japanese tissue. Let's see, the wheat starch paste is called a Zen Sofu. And both of these are reversible, so that's why they're the best to use. Remember to use these things sparingly, as introducing moisture can cause damage or cockling. We also don't recommend using any sort of pressure sensitive tapes like Scotch tape, masking tape, or duct tape. No solvent-based adhesives like rubber cement or acrylic cement. These will all cause damage to your records. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to humidify a rolled document. Humidifying and flattening rolled records takes up a lot of space, so only do it if you know you have the space to do it. And it can sometimes take a couple of days to fully unroll a record, so just keep that in mind when you start this project, that you're going to be occupying that space for some time, and you'll want to avoid moving all this stuff around. Humidifying rolled documents can be risky, so we do say you're doing this at your own risk. For any records that you're interested in flattening, it's a good idea to contact a conservator first, if only to find out what your object is made of. Different coatings and processes, such as like photographic albumin, gelatin, or collodion processes, can react differently to moisture and can have detrimental effects. So to make sure you want to know, you'll want to know ahead of time before you humidify. According to the National Park Service, paper records such as maps, newspapers, and documents that have been rolled or folded may be safely flattened using humidification, but humidification is not appropriate for all paper materials. For instance, we do not recommend humidification for paper objects that are of high intrinsic, artistic, or associative value. You should always avoid humidifying papers with water-soluble media such as watercolors and some inks. Friable media such as chalk or charcoal or pastels, as well as heavily textured media such as oil paint. These will all be damaged by humidification, so do not use in those instances. Mounted photographs. This can include a photograph that was mounted like a poster board, can sometimes withstand this process, but it just depends on how it's attached to the mounting board. Humidification can cause wrinkling, cockling, and puckering of the photograph. Also, the mounting can be distorted as well. It's also not a great process for composites or things like collages where you have one piece of paper that's affixed to another. The humidification process can cause the object that's affixed to the paper to become loose. So you want to avoid doing that for things like collages. Anything that's hand colored, a surface that has had some sort of surface retouching, inscriptions can cause different reactions. So keep this simple. You know, the safe things, like I said before, maps, newspapers, most documents can handle this. And then some more modern photographic print processes can handle rehumidification as well. In order to humidify a record, you'll want to use distilled water, at least 2 inches in the bottom of a large Tupperware, as you'll see on the left. And then you'll place a rack over the water, and you'll want to make sure that your rack is not, if it is metal, it needs to have some sort of coating on it so that the metal isn't rusting while you're rehumidifying and then causing damage to the records on top of them. You'll place the rack over the water and then put the items on top of the rack, laying them horizontally, and then you'll put on your lid. After a few hours, you'll start to feel the paper soften, and you don't want to leave it too much past this point. You really don't want the records to become moist. This is just about making them softer and looser so that you can flatten them. If they're kept in too long, this can alter the image, color, or appearance. Most records will relax in about 4 to 6 hours, but you'll want to check on these hourly so as to avoid over humidification. And you'll know that you've humidified it too much because the record can become sort of tacky or sticky to the touch. Once the items are done, remove them and sandwich them between, you'll sort of sandwich them between blotting paper or archival ragboard, and then lay some weights on top of them. So this is an example from conservationwiki.com. As you'll see here, we have our sort of object in the middle that's been rehumidified. And then you'll have a smooth board or blotting paper on the top and the bottom. And then on top of the smooth blotting board, you'll have a heavier weighted board that's not capable of bending. And then on top of those heavier weighted boards, you want to put some actual weights. We like to use, what are they called? They're sort of like bean bags, but they have rice in them, and they're sort of heavy, and they're good for weighing down things like maps. We put those on top. You can also use books. Anything that will help in the flattening of the material. So you'll need weights, a flat surface, smooth blotting paper, smooth or extra smooth, and then your heavy weight board. And the smooth boards can leave impressions. Let's see what he said here. Smooth boards do make impressions, keep impressions from being made on the photos. Apologies. And smooth boards can be paper boards and mat boards that are 100% cotton. You can also use sort of a polyester webbing. They go by the name Spondina or Hollytex, Rime or Cerex, or a silicone release paper between your object and the board to protect it from any sort of sticking. And when I say board, I mean the actual smooth board that sits on top of your photograph or document. So another way to flatten objects is doing a slow unroll. This is sort of an alternative to humidification. As you'll see here, the first document is in its natural state of curl. After a few weeks, it was placed around a slightly larger tube and then let to rest for a time. Depending on its original condition and size, you may need to do this several times. This can take quite a while. If the tubes are acidic, you'll want to wrap them in a polyester or acid-free paper first. Once the tube diameter is about 50% the size of the document, you may be able to flatten the document. So you'll want to just keep expanding until, like I said, it's about 50% of the size, and then it'll be ready to be flattened. If you feel that it will not unroll without cracking, then you can enroll it. You can continue to just gradually add tubes over time to make it larger. So you can start with a smaller tube and then get larger, because when records are already cracking, that means they're pretty brittle, and so you'll want to unroll them as slowly as possible. And you're allowing the unrolling to absorb some of the natural humidity in the air. So 50% or great humidity is best. If you live in a mountainous area or a desert area, this might not be a good method for unrolling. Yeah, and so if a record is shown, if it has a willingness to unroll, that's good. If it appears extremely stiff or brittle, we wouldn't recommend trying this method. If you have concerns about doing any of these yourself, we would recommend contacting a conservator, and this is the best resource that we know of, the American Institution for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works. Conservationists can register with this site, and you can locate them. You can locate someone to help you in your area through this link here. Okay, so before I leave, I was going to see if people can unmute themselves for this activity. I was just going to show you some records that we have in our collection, and we can talk about maybe what's the best approach for handling them. So what we have here are some rolled panoramas of the Machine Gun Troop B of Tacoma, Murray, Washington in 1921. These were rolled very tightly, and they are a more modern print, so they would do well with humidification. So it's a little bit different because I used to do this in person, but how would you handle this? Does anyone have any insights based on what we've talked about?
Right first.
I would unroll them so that they're not so tight.
Yeah. Yeah, so you could humidify these records, and then you could use the flattening process that we recommended. And once you have them flattened out, you would place them in a panoramic box that is buffered because it's a black and white.
Who would have a panoramic box? Has to be an archival place.
Yeah, so you'll have to, panoramic boxes are available through, I'm going to have a list of different websites that you'll want to check out at the end, but Hollinger is the one that we are most familiar with and use often. Gaylord is also an option. And I asked my supervisor, who's the preservation specialist, I asked her how she knew that this photograph could be humidified. And she said that she just went by the age, and that it was a more modern print. And so there are reference books where you can go to find out what type of photographic print you have. And as I said earlier in the presentation, that if you're unsure of what the process was to create the photograph that you have, you can consult a conservator to help you figure that out.
Yeah, I noticed that there is some damage to the photo.
Yeah.
Do you guys ever do photo restoration on some of these, like with Photoshop, or would you use something else to eliminate the damage? Yeah,
so we do not do conservation here at the State Archives. We used to have a conservation lab, but that went away several years ago. So normally what we would do is we would leave it as is so that it would just be together in a box. But if we were to make a digital surrogate of this record, we oftentimes, if it's really severe, we'll just leave it. But if it's a small tear, we can use Photoshop to clean up the image so that it looks good on the digital archives.
Maggie, this is Jerry Lenzen. Question for you regarding your process. I see you have cited and quoted several national park resource references. Do they run what the National Archives procedures are?
I believe so, but don't quote me on that. I just know that they are a good resource, and they have a lot of materials available online for free. I'm not really sure why, but we do like to use them as a reference.
So we would use them as a reference as well?
Yeah, if you come across anything that's on the National Parks website for conservation or preservation, it is a good reference to use, yes.
Thank you.
So I have one more example here. This is a scrapbook from Nancy Evans. So Nancy Evans was the wife of Dan Evans, our former Washington State governor. And there were a lot of problems inherent with this collection. Firstly, it's a scrapbook, so it's an oversized record requiring a special sized box. The paper that was used to originally create the scrapbook is actually highly acidic. It has photographs mixed with newspapers and other materials. And we've also come across objects that have been adhered with a glue that has caused damage as well. So in this situation, we would recommend interleaving each page with a buffered tissue paper and then separating the pages from the actual cover and putting those in 2 different boxes. Let's see. So these are some of the websites that I recommended for buying archival materials. I'll give you all a second to sort of screenshot that or write down any of them as you wish. And while you guys are taking down your notes, I just wanted to talk a little bit about mold, my favorite subject. Mold, if it is soft and fuzzy, that means that it's active. If it's powdery and hard, that means it's inactive. And you can't ever get rid of mold. You can only make it inactive. You can deactivate mold by freezing the document. You have to wrap it in a wax paper and taping it shut to avoid contamination with anything else that's in your freezer. Photographs should be interleaved with the wax paper before freezing. You can clean mold that is inactive, so meaning that it's powdery or hard, using a HEPA vac with the nylon over the vacuum tube to prevent damage, and make sure that it has sort of a variable speed so that you don't have you're not using a high suction vacuum on a sensitive document. Also, if you do have mold on your documents, you'll want to clean them outdoors or somewhere where you have lots of fresh air. And sometimes if they have like a soft brush on them, that works too. And if you do have objects that have been exposed to mold, you'll want to make sure that you've cleaned or removed or deactivated the mold before you store it with anything else that has not had mold, because mold will find its way to the other records. So you'll want to make sure everything is wiped down. Any area where you're going to be storing records should be wiped down with bleach ahead of time. Not your objects, but but like wherever you're storing it in your closet or somewhere. Materials that you can't freeze include ambrotypes, tin types, or any sort of wet collodion glass plate negatives.
We had a problem with mold last winter, and did what we could to keep the moisture out of the room, but we could definitely smell it.
Yeah.
In our flat file room. Could that mold then make its way over to our books and whatnot there?
Absolutely. Yeah, so if the room is, so I guess you'll want to maybe put, we call it the hydrothermograph, which is like a temperature and relative humidity tracker. If you put one in the room and you find that the relative humidity is particularly high, especially above 50s, I'd say 56%, and you're sensing moisture and mold growth in there, that will absolutely transfer to your books. You'll either want to remove the books from the room and try and figure out where the moisture is coming from, and then have it cleaned before putting your books back.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Okay. Sharon Thiesmeyer is not in this meeting. Eric?
Oh, let's see.
Yeah, she's not. Okay, we'll have a chat.
Okay.
Thank
so
you.
let's see if there's any questions here. Steve had a question. How does one tell if an item is acidic? So you can actually use a pH pen. They're available online, and they kind of look like a Sharpie. Let's see if I can find it here, the website. So you wouldn't necessarily use this on a record, but we like to use the pH pens. Well, actually, we have used them on records to see if, like, especially with scrapbooks, if you have like a paper in a scrapbook that might be acidic, you can draw a little line with a pH pen to make sure that it's okay for us to leave records on there. Let's see. Yeah, so they're called pH testing pens for paper products. And they're usually available on any of the number of sites that I gave you a list of. And they're on Gaylord as well. So they're called the Abbey pH pen. And it tests the pH of the paper, the mat board, folders, or envelopes, and simply by putting a tiny mark on the object. Purple indicates that it has a pH of 7 or above, and yellow indicates that it's more alkaline with a pH below 6.5. So that's a good tool to have. You also just know, I mean, newspapers are notoriously highly acidic. So that's one you can always just keep in your wheelhouse, is that newspapers are always going to be really acidic, and it's best to just keep them from other types of records. Recommendations for photo albums with sticky backgrounds. So what I'm thinking of is like the magnetic. These were used a lot in the 1980s, where they have like a sticky backing, and you put the photograph on top, and then they would have some sort of plastic film over them. These magnetic media are highly acidic, and these are pretty much the only type of scrapbook or photo album that we would take apart. We don't normally recommend taking scrapbooks apart or photo albums apart, because that can take away from the the intrinsic value of the record and understanding who made it and all those things. And so if you do have magnetic media, we have done presentations on this before, but those are the only ones that we recommend taking apart. And if you are interested in having us come back to do a presentation on scrapbooks, I'd be happy to do that, because we do have a whole lot of information about those in particular. As someone I'm a millennial, so my mom made me scrapbooks made of those, or photo albums made with those exact types of books. And I have the task now of I'm imaging all of them. I'm going to be digitally imaging all of my my photo books as they exist now, or taking them apart in time, because you know, those photographs are all I have. I don't have a digital copy of any of them, so you'll want to preserve those as best you can. One more question. A wide format World War I photograph of my grandfather's army company at Fort Lewis was originally shipped in a tube, no archival anything around it, and has been stored in that tube for the past century. I'm afraid to unroll it due to potential cracking. Should I try? Honestly, if you have concerns about it cracking, I would leave it in the tube. And if you have the means to consult a conservator, or even a local archive, if you came here and wanted to meet with Mary or I, we could sort of give you some advice about it, or sort of it's possible that it would be fine being rehumidified, but of course, if you're concerned, I wouldn't try it on my own. So that's an option as well.
Maggie?
Yeah.
I have a comment.
Sure.
We get this dry rid from Fred Meyer's, and we put it in the car because that's where our moisture problem is. But my sister puts it in her closet, and it might be a temporary thing that Steve could use for his dampness problem until he finds out where the moisture is coming from.
Yeah,
It really does make a difference.
Yeah, any way to reduce moisture is a good option for sure.
We were already using that this winter.
Oh. Then you have a problem.
Yeah, so I suspect a leaky something or something happening over there. Any other questions?
Just one thing. It would be highly, you would want to use a lot of caution. I used to be a commercial photographer. Hydrating photographs is very risky, because if you hit them with too much moisture, the silver nitrate can adhese, and you wind up destroying the photograph.
Yes. Yes. That's why I say proceed at your own risk. We do use this process here at the archives, but of course, you know, we have a preservation specialist here who knows, you know, what is appropriate for this process and what isn't. So, like I said before, you'll want to consult with someone ahead of time before doing anything like that, especially with photographs. Absolutely.
Maggie, I have another suggestion. You were talking about the sticky vac storage books.
Yeah.
I have friends, at least, and I've done it a couple of times myself, to scan those particular pages with all the images left in place.
Yeah.
So you're preserving the images, but you're not serving them.
Yeah, so you're preserving the context and how they were originally put together. Yeah, that's what we recommend.
Thank you very much, Maggie.
Welcome.
Really interesting presentation.